Egypt believed their gods controlled everything.
The Nile, the sun, life and death.
To defy Pharaoh was to defy the universe itself.
Until one man appeared. No army, no throne, and brought history's greatest empire to its knees. Today, you will discover who Moses was,
and why this clash changed humanity's fate forever.
Before continuing, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now stay until the end, because what comes next is not told in common books. Moses, the man who opened the Red Sea and defied the gods of Egypt. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie was excavating the arid mountains of the Sinai Peninsula when his tools touched something that would forever change the debate about the existence of Moses. At Serebit el-Qadim, an ancient Egyptian turquoise mine, Petrie discovered alphabetic inscriptions carved into the rocks, marks left by workers more than 3,800 years ago. He did not yet know that he was holding in his hands possibly the first physical evidences of the man who defied the greatest empire of the time and opened the Red Sea. Petrie's Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions dated from the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, approximately 1,800 years before Christ. This was the period when Egypt reached the peak of power during the 12th dynasty. Amenemhat III ruled for 45 years, building the complex labyrinth of Hawara and the grandiose irrigation project of Lake Moeris. Under his command, mining expeditions regularly arrived in Sinai in search of turquoise and copper. Among the workers were Egyptians, but also Semites coming from Canaan. What no one imagined is that these inscriptions held a secret that would remain hidden for almost a century. The power of Egypt in that period was not merely military, it was cosmic. The Egyptians believed that their pharaoh controlled the order of the universe. The Nile River obeyed the pharaoh. The sun rose because the pharaoh ordered it. Life and death were domains of his divine authority. To question him was to question the gods themselves. The records of the 12th dynasty show a civilization at the peak of confidence. The pyramids were already ancient to them, monuments of a previous era. Now they built labyrinths, irrigation systems, and funerary complexes that defied the limits of engineering. But something was about to shake this apparently eternal order. Hieratic documents of the time reveal that Asiatic workers were present in Egypt throughout the Middle Kingdom. They were not slaves in the modern sense, but specialized workers, soldiers, builders, and miners who served the Egyptian crown. Many came from Canaan during periods of severe drought, when the only hope of survival lay on the fertile banks of the Nile. Egyptian records show Semitic names growing in the administrative lists of the 12th dynasty. It was a time of documented population movement, of cultures mixing, and of identities being forged. What the Egyptian scribes did not record was that among these Semitic workers a consciousness was being born that one day would defy the very concept of pharaonic divine authority. In 2024, more than a century after Petrie, the independent researcher Michael Barron re-examined the inscriptions of Serebit el-Qadim using cutting-edge technology. High-resolution images, three-dimensional scans, and casts preserved at the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East revealed something extraordinary. Barron identified specific linguistic patterns and, even more importantly, found direct references to the name Emesh, Moses. The inscriptions contained phrases like ZT-Emesh, which he translated as "this comes from Emeshem," and Num Emeshen, interpreted as a saying of Emeshian. If Barron was correct, those rocks of Sinai preserved not only the first physical evidence of the existence of Moses, but possibly the only surviving writings of a founding biblical figure. The impact of this discovery is still being evaluated by the academic community. The language of the inscriptions was a Northwest Semitic dialect, close to ancient biblical Hebrew, with Aramaic influences. Barron identified specific forms of the letter Mem that would be associated with Semitic scribes of the Egyptian elite. This aligned perfectly with the biblical narrative that showed Moses being raised in the Pharaoh's court, having access to education and Egyptian writing traditions. The discovery also suggested something more intriguing: a possible religious conflict at Serabit el-Qadim. Bahrain found evidences of alterations in the inscriptions, where symbols associated with the goddess Baalat were erased and replaced by references to El, the deity associated with primitive Hebrew worship. It was as if a theological rebellion had happened in the Egyptian minds themselves, but not all experts agreed with Bahrain's interpretations. Thomas Schneider, Egyptologist at the University of British Columbia, considered the allegations completely unfounded and misleading. For Schneider, the identification of the letters was arbitrary and could distort the ancient history of Egypt. Even if the translation were correct, this did not necessarily mean that the inscriptions had been written by the biblical Moses. Leanne Feldman of Princeton University observed that Moses was actually a common name in ancient Egypt, appearing in letters and legal documents of the New Kingdom. The controversy illustrated a fundamental problem in biblical archaeology: how to distinguish between evidence and interpretation, between discovery and the desire for confirmation. While academics debated the Sinai inscriptions, other archaeological evidences began to form a broader pattern. About 300 kilometers to the north, in the excavations of Tel el-Daba, the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak had discovered since 1966 a city that defied simple classifications. The site, originally known as Rawati and later as Avaris, had been the capital of the Hyksos, a Semitic people who ruled parts of Egypt between 1,650 and 1,550 years before Christ. The city revealed a unique mixture of Egyptian and Canaanite cultures, with grandiose palaces of Egyptian style and everyday objects that reflected Canaanite traditions. It was exactly the type of environment where a Hebrew could grow up as an Egyptian prince without completely losing his Semitic identity. In Avaris, Bietak made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The remains of a monumental statue of an Asiatic ruler were found in a cemetery at the site. The statue, almost twice natural size, portrayed a seated figure with a mushroom-shaped hairstyle, typical of non-Egyptian rulers of the Canaan region. The most intriguing part was that the statue had been deliberately destroyed, suggesting political turbulence in the region. Some researchers speculated if this could be a representation of Joseph, which would directly connect the archaeological records with the biblical narratives. What made the hypothesis even more fascinating was the fact that no intact human remains were found in the tomb associated with the statue. The absence of a complete skeleton aligned perfectly with the biblical record that showed Joseph making the Israelites swear to carry his bones. When they left Egypt, Moses would have fulfilled this promise during the Exodus. Bietak observed that the tomb had been almost completely looted by thieves, but grave robbers normally looked for treasures, not bodies. The complete removal of human remains suggested something different, an intentional, planned, and respectful transfer. The striped tunic of the statue, with its red, black, and white colors, inevitably recalled the coat of many colors of Joseph mentioned in Genesis. Although the evidence was not conclusive, the convergence of details created an intriguing pattern that connected archaeology and biblical text in ways previously unimaginable. The period, represented by Avaris and the Sinai inscriptions, was characterized by seismic changes in the ancient world. The Egyptian 12th dynasty was coming to an end. Amenemhat III had allowed massive entry of Asiatic settlers into the delta to provide workforce for his ambitious mining and construction projects. But these activities, combined with inadequate Nile floods, were weakening the Egyptian economy. The central power began to show signs of weakness. It was the type of environment where alternative identities could flourish, where a young man raised as an Egyptian could rediscover his Semitic roots, and where the apparently eternal authority of the Pharaoh could be questioned for the first time in history. But history was about to take an even more dramatic direction. The decline of the 12th dynasty gave rise to what historians call the Second Intermediate Period, an era of political fragmentation and foreign invasions. It was during this period that the Hyksos assumed control of large parts of Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris and ruling as pharaohs for more than a century. These Semitic rulers introduced new military technologies, including chariots pulled by horses and improved composite bows. But they also brought something more subtle and powerful, an alternative view of authority that did not depend on traditional pharaonic divinity. The result would be a transformation that would change not only Egypt, but the entire course of human history. In parallel to the archaeological discoveries, an ancient Egyptian document was gaining new academic attention. The Ipuwer papyrus, preserved in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, in the Netherlands, described a period of calamity that had devastated Egypt. The text spoke of rivers turned into blood, widespread famine, mass death, and complete collapse of social order. The descriptions were so vivid and specific that they created inevitable parallels with the plagues described in the Book of Exodus. The papyrus mentioned servants abandoning their masters, which some interpreted as a reference to the flight of slaves. Even more disturbing, the document suggested that the pharaoh himself had died without receiving a proper burial. The academic consensus on the Ipuwer papyrus remained divided. Most Egyptologists considered the document an example of lamentation literature, a common genre in ancient Egypt that emphasized chaos to justify the need for a strong government. Similar texts like the prophecies of Nefertiti described apocalyptic scenarios that were likely fictional. However, some scholars argued that the specificity of Ipuwer's descriptions suggested real events behind the literary rhetoric. The fact that the papyrus did not explicitly mention Moses or the Israelites both weakened and strengthened the case. It weakened it because there was no direct connection, but strengthened it because it suggested an independent source describing the same events. The dating of the Ipuwer papyrus presented another puzzle. The available document was a copy from the 19th dynasty, but the content referred to events much earlier, possibly from the 12th dynasty. This created a temporal window that aligned with the Sinai inscriptions and the evidence from Avaris. If the three sets of evidence were indeed related, they would point to a specific period of Egyptian history when extraordinary events shook the foundations of pharaonic power. They were the types of events that would leave deep marks on the collective memory, the type of historical trauma that would transform into a foundational narrative for a people in formation. But what really happened in those turbulent years of the 12th dynasty remained a mystery that challenged both archaeologists and historians. The evidences were fragmentary, contradictory, and open to multiple interpretations. What could not be denied was that something significant had occurred, something powerful enough to be remembered through millennia, preserved in rock inscriptions, papyrus documents, and oral narratives that eventually would become the fundamental texts of Western civilization. The man at the center of this historical storm remained an enigmatic figure, half Egyptian prince, half Semitic shepherd, whose very existence continued to be debated in the most prestigious academic circles of the world. Chapter 2. The true measure of Moses' influence did not reside only in the disputed archaeological evidences, but in what happened after. Between the 15th and 13th centuries before Christ, when the Egyptian 18th dynasty expelled the Hyksos and re-established control over all of Egypt, something fundamental had changed. Pharaoh Ahmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty, led military campaigns that recaptured Avaris and pushed the Semitic invaders back to Canaan. But he could not erase what these groups had planted in the consciousness of the ancient world, the idea that divine authority could come from a source different from pharaonic power. The records of the 18th dynasty reveal an obsession with the restoration of traditional Egyptian order. Ahmose I and his successors strove to erase traces of the Hyksos occupation, destroying monuments, rewriting inscriptions, and rebuilding temples according to classic Egyptian standards. It was as if they were trying to heal a wound in the national psyche, to restore a worldview that had been fundamentally shaken. But some groups of Semites remained in Egypt after the expulsion of the Hyksos. Administrative documents show Semitic names continuing to appear in official records, especially in activities related to construction and mining. These remnants kept alive traditions that eventually would transform into something that Egypt could not control. During this period of Egyptian consolidation, archaeological evidences suggest that Proto-Israelite groups were settling in the mountains of Canaan. Archaeological surveys show a dramatic increase in the number of small rural settlements in the highlands between 1,200 and 1,000 years before Christ. These communities had distinct characteristics: four-room houses, absence of pig bones, and simple pottery that contrasted with the Canaanite standards of the plains. It was as if a new type of society was emerging, a society that consciously differentiated itself from the traditional power structures of the region. What made this even more intriguing was that many of these settlements showed signs of having been founded by people with experience in construction and engineering. The analysis of the material culture of these archaeological sites revealed a society in conscious transformation. The construction techniques were sophisticated, but deliberately different from Canaanite or Egyptian traditions. The water storage systems were ingenious, suggesting knowledge acquired in arid environments. More importantly, there were no evidences of centralized religious structures or palaces that indicated rigid social hierarchy. It was a social organization that seemed designed to avoid both the Canaanite tyranny of city-states and Egyptian absolutism. Archaeologists began to realize that they were observing not just a migration, but a conscious social experiment. The chronology of these changes aligned remarkably with the traditions preserved in the biblical texts. If the Sinai inscriptions really referred to Moses, and if the evidences of Avaris reflected the presence of Israelites in Egypt, then the period between 1,400 and 1,200 years before Christ would represent exactly the temporal window when these groups would have left Egypt and settled in Canaan, not as invaders conquering by force, but as refugees rebuilding a society according to radically different principles. The silence of Egyptian records regarding the Exodus could be explained not only by political shame, but by the fact that Egyptian scribes simply did not have categories to comprehend what was happening. The academic debate on the historicity of Moses reflected broader tensions regarding the relationship between archaeology and religious text. Israel Finkelstein, director of the Institute of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, argued that archaeological evidences did not support a massive exodus as described in the Bible. For Finkelstein and other minimalist archaeologists, the narratives of the Pentateuch were literary compositions of the 7th century before Christ, created to legitimize the political project of national unification of King Josiah. This perspective viewed the stories of Moses as brilliantly constructed foundational myths, but historically unfounded. However, other scholars questioned whether the absence of archaeological evidence constituted evidence of absence. Rodrigo Silva, a Brazilian archaeologist specializing in biblical archaeology, observed that the nomadic nature of the pilgrimage in the desert would naturally leave few material traces. Furthermore, many events and figures of antiquity are known primarily through literary texts, not physical evidences. The destruction of ancient libraries like Alexandria and Constantinople had eliminated contemporary documentation about many historical figures. For Silva and other conservative archaeologists, documentary poverty was a general problem of antiquity, not specific to biblical narratives. What emerged from the academic debates was a growing recognition that the question of the historicity of Moses could not be resolved through archaeological evidence alone. The Sinai discoveries, the excavations of Avaris, the Ipuwer papyrus, and the Proto-Israelite settlements of Canaan formed a suggestive but not conclusive pattern. Each piece of the puzzle could be explained in multiple ways. What could not be denied was that something extraordinary had happened in the transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the Levant, something that produced a new form of social organization, a new conception of divine authority, and a new narrative about the relationship between human power and cosmic justice. The influence of these ideas would spread far beyond the mountains of Canaan. During the following centuries, when the great Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires dominated the Middle East, the traditions associated with Moses remained alive among dispersed communities. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ would be the catalyst for the final codification of these oral traditions into written texts. But even during the Persian period, when the Jews returned to Jerusalem and began to rebuild their temple, evidence emerged that knowledge about these traditions was not universal. The Elephantine papyri, documents of the 5th century before Christ discovered on an island in the Nile, revealed a thriving Jewish community in Egypt that possessed its own temple dedicated to Yahweh. The most intriguing thing about the Jewish community of Elephantine was that their documents did not show knowledge of the Exodus traditions as a traumatic event. They celebrated Passover, but without the meaning of liberation from Egyptian slavery that would be central to later traditions. For these Egyptian Jews, Passover seemed to be observed as a religious tradition associated with the renewal of the covenant with Yahweh, possibly linked to ancient agricultural festivals. This suggested that in the 5th century before Christ, the story of the Exodus was not yet universally accepted as a fundamental historical event among all Jewish communities. The narrative was still in the process of codification and dissemination. The question that remained was how to separate the possible historical core from later literary elaboration. Even the most rigorous skeptics recognized that the narratives about Moses contained elements that suggested historical authenticity. The description of specific Egyptian details, knowledge of Sinai routes, references to mineral practices, and precise characterization of conflicts between Semitic groups and Egyptian authorities pointed to sources that had direct knowledge of the world of the 2nd millennium before Christ. Furthermore, as observed by biblical studies expert Nahum Sana, no nation would invent for itself a tradition so dishonorable as slavery unless there were a true core behind the narrative. The enduring impact of the Mosaic traditions did not depend only on their historical accuracy, but on their transformative force. The ideas associated with Moses, that divine authority could defy human power, that slaves could become free, that universal moral laws could transcend tribal or national loyalties, continued reverberating through history. The ethical monotheism that emerged from these traditions would influence not only Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam. The conception of social justice and human rights that developed from these roots would shape liberation movements throughout the following millennia. While archaeologists continued excavating and philologists deciphering ancient texts, the figure of Moses remained at the center of fundamental questions about historical evidence, religious faith, and cultural memory. Recent discoveries, from the Sinai inscriptions to the finds at Avaris, did not definitively resolve the debate about his existence, but enriched the context in which these discussions took place. They showed that the world of the 2nd millennium before Christ was more complex, more intercultural, and more dynamic than previous generations of scholars had imagined. It was a world where an exceptional individual could indeed have emerged to defy the most solid power structures of his time. Technology continued revealing new aspects of ancient worlds. DNA analyses of Egyptian mummies, radiocarbon dating of archaeological sites, spectroscopy of ancient inscriptions, and computer modeling of climate patterns were providing increasingly precise data about the 2nd millennium before Christ. But paradoxically, the more scientists learned about this period, the more complex became the task of separating historical fact from literary elaboration in the traditions about Moses. Each new discovery opened new sets of questions. Each technological advance revealed additional layers of ambiguity. What emerged from the most recent studies was a growing understanding that the historicity of Moses might be less important than his historical impact. Regardless of his existence as an individual, the ideas associated with his name transformed the course of human civilization. The notion that divine authority could be invoked against human injustice, that universal moral codes transcended political power, that marginalized groups could defy apparently invincible empires. These revolutionary conceptions shaped not only religious literature, but also the development of concepts like human rights, international justice, and social responsibility. The debate about Moses also revealed the limitations and possibilities of archaeology as a historical discipline. Archaeology excelled in reconstructing patterns of material life, population movements, technological developments, and environmental changes. But it had difficulties in capturing dimensions like ideas, beliefs, personal motivations, and spiritual transformations that could be central to understanding figures like Moses. Archaeological sites preserved the remains of societies, but did not necessarily preserve the souls of those societies. Inscriptions recorded names and titles, but rarely captured the internal struggles that led individuals to defy everything they knew. In the end, the question of Moses remained open, a mystery that symbolized broader tensions between science and faith, between archaeological evidence and cultural tradition, between academic skepticism and the human search for meaning. Evidences continued accumulating, some supporting elements of the biblical traditions, others questioning their historical accuracy. But perhaps the most important question was not whether Moses existed exactly as described in the ancient texts, but how the ideas associated with him continued inspiring movements for justice and freedom through the millennia. In this sense, the influence of Moses transcended questions of historical evidence to touch deeper dimensions of the human experience. The eternal tension between power and justice, between established authority and moral change, between acceptance of the status quo and a transformative vision of how the world could be different.